Hi everyone, today I'm going to talk to you about reflections on life and death, the looking glass of human vanity. I thought very carefully about my title today because we've now gone through a series of looking at different ways of shooting in a style of Vanitas. And I wanted especially to focus on the reflective qualities that we may find within a lot of those paintings and that we can then reference and make good use of in our own photographs. And I also wanted to start drawing more attention to the human element of Vanitas painting. In a lot of the work we've studied, there's no human element apart from the oblique sense of human presence through the objects that we see. So the human, the character, is implied through the objects, and we maybe start to build up a kind of narrative or an understanding of character through what is displayed within the scene of Vanitas. And a reminder that Vanitas actually is intended to draw our attention to our human vanities, that we are looking at imagery that conjures our sense that we are impermanent, we are not here forever, and that our material possessions are in fact dead. They are dead things, as much as one day we will die. And I said in another presentation, and I'll say it again, that we cannot take our possessions with us when we die. And Vanitas painting certainly was serving that purpose. We're looking at objects that are perhaps important to us now, but that have a transience in their own right. Things that will be of no use at some point, especially not to us. So in the first image we can see today, yes, there's straight away a reflection, that's very obvious. There's a limited colour palette, or so we think at first glance, where we're looking at objects that are red and white against the black background. I do want you to notice the pop of blue and green in the sunglasses, and then in the label that's sewn into the sole of the shoe. It's partially concealed by my title. But those additions are extremely important to the balance of this image. And again, a note on that, when you're making your own photographs, that the human eye is really happiest when it sees balance in colour. So when looking at colour, the human eye seeks full spectrum. We find that all the time in painting or in photographs, and I'm not sure if you've ever even experienced it when you've been making your own work. But if we have a limited colour palette, for example, we want to think about all red, there often is still an inclusion of yellow and blue somewhere, even if it's tiny little speckles of dots of colour, so that we have that balance, that complement through the full colour spectrum. And if we think about the objects that are here, there's really fascinating juxtapositions between objects. We have a slab of meat next to beautifully crafted leather handbags. We have the can of Coke, that kind of sickly saccharine fizzy pop we know is terribly bad for our teeth. As much as it's delicious, we know it's really bad for our health. And we have colours then that tie in with, for example, the shoe. Almost like a kind of subliminal health warning about these objects. Now, this is a commercial photograph. It's designed to sell us things. It's designed to talk to us or speak to us about lifestyle. And most commercial photographs, of course, are doing that. It's selling us an idea. It's selling us a product. The reflection, as I've already mentioned, is a really vital element of the image. And today, when we look at the work by the photographer I've selected, we'll see time and time again how light is both bounced back in reflection, as well as form and shape, and also how light is refracted through objects. And that's something that the Vanitas painters in the 17th century were also really familiar with. It's something they used as a visual device to support ideas of, again, impermanence, and also simply to show off their skill at how well they could paint. So, an image by the same photographer, although it at first appears to be very different. And the things I've written there on the slide, is this a Vanitas image? Could we actually consider this to be a Vanitas photograph? And in the discussion of that question with my class, there were lots of things that came up about how this is able to identify as a Vanitas image. Fair enough, we don't have a skull lying on a surface, but we do have a very modern interpretation of the Vanitas conventions. We have a distorted eye through the refraction of the light and liquid in the vessel. We have objects lying on a wooden surface, and we have a plain background. And as much as that background isn't really, really dark and heavy, it has a kind of somber quality to it. We also can tell that light is coming from a single direction. We've got lots of bounced light in this image. It's very cleverly set up. So although ostensibly we have 3 objects, the placement of those objects allows the light to work its way into our vision, our overall impression of what we see in this photograph. And the thing that sets the work in time is actually the human presence. So in Vanitas painting traditionally, we didn't see a human, but the human was alluded to through possessions, through objects. Here we have a much more obvious sense that there is a person present, although that person is distorted. Now, for me, this really is representative of something to do with, again, time passing. The distortion itself is about our truncated view on perhaps what's important in life. But there are lots of qualities in this photograph that would speak to us of memento mori, of trying to immortalise that which cannot be immortalised because it is in fact mortal, and also simply in the beauty of benign objects that become elevated through their position or through their general context. So that glassy pebble has a relationship with the vessel through which the model looks. And through the looking, even though it's distorted, even though we see an eye that is enlarged and quite sort of bizarre, we understand that there's movement. And of course, there can't be movement without time. So the photographer, the Swedish photographer, Julia Hetta, that is our focus for today. She's very, very well regarded as a commercial photographer. She gets lots of big clients working with her. One of her biggest clients is Gucci. She's shot lots of their fashion advertising campaigns. And for someone who's so well regarded, there's actually relatively little information about her. Her biographical information is really quite scant. That's sometimes a good thing. It maybe poses problems for us as students if we want to write things about her to inform the context in which we believe her to be working. But it also gives us an enormous freedom in discussing her work without the weight of having to say, well, she did this because of that thing in her life, or she was responding only to these particular elements within her broader experience. Simply, we are looking at what she's produced. And as I said, she is a commercial photographer. She's often trying to sell us a product in her work. But even so, her work also for me stands as beautiful, fine art photography. And that's not just because there are lots of references to classical painting, and not just because there are lots of references to a wider art history, but simply because often, even when it is a commercial photograph, the inclusion of the object she's trying to sell is so subtle, it's almost subliminal. And the photograph on its own stands as a very fine, very careful, very beautifully crafted piece of visual art. It says there, I found this in Photographer magazine, Hetta's photographs provide a glimpse of an alternative world rich with the romance and quietude associated with classical painting. Working almost exclusively with natural light and long exposure times, Hetta imbues her subjects with a sense of serenity and power. Well, objects do have a kind of token, sort of totemic sense. When we look at the image that's on the screen now, for example, very simple objects become elevated. We see this all the time, simply by the photographer looking and selecting an object to photograph. The object becomes elevated in its significance. We know that happens. when we think about gathering objects together, not only are we looking at a single object that has meaning, but we're trying to work out the relationships between those objects. And even if we cast our mind back to the very first image on my starter slide today, the relationship between the ketchup, the Coke, the shoe, the bags, the meat, the sunglasses, all these things help us to form an understanding of what the actual narrative is. What is the story going on in these photographs? And truthfully, when I look at this photograph, I'm not sure of a story that Julia Hetta was thinking of, but certainly I can project onto this image the relationship stories of the small marble bust and the rock and the beautiful onyx-like carved bird. There's something really ancient in the symbolism being used in this photograph. And immediately, of course, that impresses me. I'm a sucker for a smart photographer. I like seeing references that take me into a classical world or into something about mythology. That's personal to me, but you may feel the same. And even if you don't, perhaps you can see the purely visual qualities within a photograph like this. Now, this is an interesting comparison to what I was saying about colour, because the colours in this are completely pared back. So although it's a colour image, we have very little imprint of any kind of garish hue. There's really nothing there for us to look at in terms of colour, and yet what is there is so beautiful, muted, subtle, considered. And so there's even a relationship in the kind of colour qualities within the frame. And likewise with the image and the distorted eye of the model, we were looking at something where the colours had been pared right back, so that we can focus perhaps on the objects very, very intensely. From the kind of canon of her work, there are obviously lots of fashion photographs from her commercial portfolio. I think what's really, really brilliant in her work is that there are always mirror points. So in all the images we've looked at so far, there is an inclusion of a glass surface in some way or another. Even if it's not reflective like a mirror, there's certainly a glass vessel included. And then a quality of light that comes from using glass, from allowing light to travel through or bounce off of surfaces. And even when there isn't an obvious sense that there's any glass included within the frame, in the central image, for example, there's another kind of mirroring happening in that we have an orange t-shirt and the hair on the model painted in the image on the t-shirt is also orange, and that contrasts immediately with the light points we see hanging down on the pearls and the earrings, that very kind of otherwise pared back colour palette. In many ways, it's really opulent. There's an opulence to these colours. But again, there are references right back to classical painting, again, with colour. And also the inclusion of those other objects, the props that are being used by the photographer, are very cleverly considered and put together so that we're harking back to a time that is not now. And yet here we are in an ultra-contemporary paradigm thinking about fashion. And similarly, the image with the red t-shirt, there's actually, again, lots of glass objects, a clever device to bounce light and also to speak of those classical values. Above me, I think a very subtle and again very clever way of photographing glass and light is that we have a kind of harlequin-like model sitting at a table. It's quite a disconcerting photograph, I think. And we have an egg in a glass, and the light on that egg is coming from what we think of as the wrong direction. But nonetheless, that leads us to believe that light is coming from somewhere. And again, this is all rooting around in really kind of subconscious territory perhaps, but when we see that, we may not be aware that the light is coming from the wrong direction, but we do get a sense that there's something unsettling, something jarring in an otherwise extremely muted photograph. as I said, painters in the 17th century wanted to show off how marvellous they were technically at painting those glassy surfaces. The way that light travels is of endless fascination to all kinds of artists. We remember that as photographers, we're drawing with light, and so it makes sense that we're incredibly aware of how light operates within the photographs we shoot. I spoke to my class about these photographs. Everybody agreed that there was a sense of being quite unsettled again by them. They're beautiful to look at. We can spend a long time looking at them, studying them, and trying to work out what's there. But we also perhaps feel a bit disturbed or disrupted by what we see. In fact, one student commenting on the image that's above me now said that it was really creepy because he felt that the young girl was aware we were watching her, but she was still intent on blowing that bubble. Again, the bubble, wonderful thing to play with in terms of light and how light bounces and operates within a photograph. But all the time, these references back to painting, particularly Vanitas painting, that's very important for us. And the objects that are chosen are all laden with meaning. They're all heavily involved in telling the story of something to do with our vanity or our impermanence, our fleeting time upon this earth. So, I mean, the question there is, are we unsettled by Hetta's imagery? I think overwhelmingly my students fed back to me that yes, they were. And that was because of a sense of mystery and of darkness. And even in photographs that are intended to sell us things, you know, sometimes we think that commercial photography or photographs that are trying to flog a product should make us feel really happy, that they should be fun and light and carefree seeming, and sell us that kind of quality of lifestyle. But there's also this incredible power in darkness. In life, of course, that's a very dangerous thing. In advertising, it's a very powerful thing. And the associations we make with our work, as I've already said many times, classical painting, Vanitas painting, but also this dreamlike, quite whimsical quality. Commenting again on a sort of human nature, part of human nature that maybe is difficult for us. And then this photograph particularly is the one that I've used to inspire what I've been working on in response to Hetta's work. And I've said there, the inclusion of the model creates an entirely different dynamic than if we were just looking at the objects. There's natural light again, you know, she said herself she's using mainly natural light, so no big fancy lighting rigs. And she's working with quite long exposure times, which kind of softens the edges, particularly of her human subjects, because even when we're not aware of it, we're always sort of moving. So you'll know that long exposure times when the eye of the camera is open for longer means that often we pick up lots of blur, lots of movement that we're not aware of otherwise. But the other thing it does is that if it's very controlled and if the models and the objects are very, very still, we don't get any blur, but what we do get is beautifully nuanced hues and tones that we often don't get if we've had a very fast shutter speed. So I've said there, the natural light allows soft illumination, diffusion, and gentle shadow. So there are no stark shadows in this. It's definitely a Vanitas photograph. The model sets us in time, but what she's wearing doesn't especially. We have a skull, we have a timer, a sand timer, a glass sand timer, and we also have a glass vessel filled with clear liquid. The model is touching her face and with her other finger touching that glass orb, which is refracting the light and turning the world upside down. Now, if I was going to do a kind of reading of this photograph immediately, I'm making assumptions about who this model is, or rather what she is thinking or feeling. And although she's neutral in her expression, to me, this photograph is actually about the sadness of aging. You know, her beauty is fleeting. We're looking at a beautiful model, and she's surrounded by these reminders of time. What better statement about Vanitas, the notions of Vanitas, than this kind of work? The liquid in the vessel, this kind of fluidity of life. The skull is the inevitability of death. The sand timer is about the inevitability of time passing. All the conventions are in place. It absolutely is a Vanitas photograph. And if I'm thinking about what I would like you to do, I want you to create a new page on your websites, and I would like you to title it The Looking Glass. This work is going to take you longer than some of the other shoots I've advised, because you're going to have to plan, produce and shoot a Vanitas style series of photographs. Now, series is not just one or two, it's 3 or more. But these should be really carefully crafted photographs. There should be nothing accidental in them. They are very controlled. And remembering that every object you put within the frame is going to tell a story, or indeed tell part of a story that arises through the relationship between the objects. And I want you to use a human model this time. I want you to take from what Julia Hetta has showed us and create Vanitas work that includes the actual human. I want you to write analysis of Hetta's work. So using all that key art vocabulary that you know I love you to use, showing off your awareness of technical things and using technical language. I want you to compare her work to Vanitas painting. And also the other photographers we've studied. I mean, Justine Rees, for example, would be a really excellent comparison to this work, because Justine Rees isn't using a human in her photographs, but she's using like a residual sense of person or a person in her work. And then stretch and challenge is for you to create a moving image, a GIF or a stop motion series, including the human model again, and working within the Vanitas still life format, but thinking very much about how you can show something unexpected. So, in creating your moving image or your GIF, we're harking back to, again, some Taylor Wood, thinking about how over time, even a very short span of time, often humans lose interest very easily. We're extremely distractible. But if we stay with your images, then this beautiful and unexpected thing is going to happen. And perhaps that's symbolic also of what's happening in our lives and our deaths. Is that, you know, we are terrified of dying, and yet maybe if we really stay with our fear about it, we find something that is in actual fact beautiful, has its own grace. And so as usual, if we were in class, I'd be demonstrating. We've got my usual setup scene, my very messy kitchen, my doctor's LOL doll, a plate from lunch, and a dirty handkerchief. I'm so sorry. But that's how I was shooting. So I was thinking about the objects I wanted to use. I was thinking also, of course, about those reflections and reflective surfaces. So I gathered together 3 tall glasses. I had a champagne flute, I had a stubby wine glass, like a regular wine glass, and I had a slightly taller wine glass as well. I've kept, as you know, my my grapes over several shoots now. I've had them here for a few weeks, so they're getting really, really wrinkly. And I've also kept my flowers, the peonies I had from a few weeks ago as well, and I've just let them wrinkle back and die back as much as they can. I know sometimes that's difficult at home if parents aren't keen on you keeping old or decaying stuff. It's easy for me. We're in the middle of building, so the house is a building site anyway. It made no difference that I keep them. But actually sometimes be prudent about what you're going to shoot. think about if you have a beautiful flower that you keep it a bit longer and let it die back a bit, and then photograph it. Find out what qualities it has in its slightly different form, because they may be still surprisingly beautiful. I had my black background. I did a couple of photographs where I just played around with the object. You can see that one in the middle. I'm really compressing the space. Obviously, I'm not getting any of the outside frame of my shoot space, my studio, my makeshift studio. This is about problem solving often, and the sort of technical side of this stuff is that yes, we want to load our photographs up with meaning, we want to show that we're aware of our context, but we have to be practical people as well. I mean, you would laugh if you'd seen how I created the studio. It was my laundry dryer, my rack that I put my wet clothes on, and I had a big canvas that I wasn't using, and I balanced that onto the drying rack, and I had a skateboard weighing it down on the other side. And you know, we're not all going to have access to perfect studio spaces. In fact, I don't know anyone actually who does. I had a mirror, a big mirror. I took it off the wall. I realised it was dirty. In fact, you can see in my setup picture there, I got my glass cleaner. I had to wipe it down. I did do some shots which I haven't included here just on the wooden table, but my wooden table is too light. It didn't look right. It looked too kind of jolly. So I went back to using the mirror. And you can see then in the image above me as well, I started experimenting with including my human model, and that was me. I was thinking very much about Vanitas as my human vanity. I was thinking about what do the objects represent because I'm included within the frame. And I hope this makes sense to you, but you know, I really did spend time thinking about how there was a relationship between me as I am, the objects I was shooting, and even things like the clothes I was wearing. I didn't want anything to set me in time. So those of you who know me will know that I'm, you know, never going to be wearing a bright pink top or anything. But I did wear just very simple clothes to photograph myself. The reflection has its own narrative. I really want to come back to this. A student of mine was talking to me about the fact that the mirror is the afterlife. It's actually showing us what is beyond our physical realm. So in the mirror space, in that reflection, there is something of what we've known and is recognisable, but it's gone beyond the point at which we can touch life. I think that's a really beautiful way to think about what a reflection represents in these kinds of photographs. And think about how you group your objects. I've written it there. How you position your model within the frame. Now, again, this is a practical thing. You saw my studio setup. I didn't have enough black fabric to put that black fabric up and over me. So when I was photographing the reflection, I was very aware you could see my white ceiling, and I didn't want that. So what that's meant as a compensation is that I've cut off my reflections. Now, that was sad that I had to do that. I would much rather have had the full length of the reflection so I could see all the objects perfectly balanced. But I wanted to retain that black background, that heaviness of the background. I want you to consider saturation, colour, colour temperature, and the narrative quality of what you shoot. And also thinking about how you personally relate to the objects within the frame. Now, obviously, I've shot myself. You can have another model. It doesn't have to be you. Really, what I was commenting on when I was making these photographs is the sense that I'm aware of my own vanity. You know, I'm at a point in my life maybe where I'm starting to notice that the way I look is changing. So I don't allude to be the model in Julia Hetta's photograph, but I'm certainly aware that I'm losing the looks I've had. I'm moving into a new phase of my life. And I thought about that with the position of things like my hand on my face, the concealment of my face, in the actual reality. And then in the reflection, especially in that middle image, you can actually see my eye. And so that was making a relationship between looking into the future as well, or looking beyond what is now, certainly. I've got those wrinkled old grapes. I've got the dead flowers. All of this is coming back to comments about my own vanity, how I've clung on to that, and how that's completely ridiculous because there's an inevitability to life. And just finally, I used this photograph as my main example. It's actually my favourite, but there's something very disappointing that I didn't realise until after I'd edited and put my PowerPoint together, and that's that you can see the pattern on my t-shirt. So where I was talking before about being really careful when you shoot your own photographs, please be mindful you don't want any logos visible on clothing, because that's setting us in time in a way that perhaps we don't want. I'm thinking very much back to that Hetta photograph, yes, of the model touching the orb, thinking about her vanity and how she's losing her looks, but I'm also thinking back to that other image I showed you where we had the big eye that was distorted through the glass vessel. The clothes were neutral. That's not what we were looking at so much in context of this work, at least. And one other quick mention about something technical I said before about colour temperature. I took the saturation down so the photograph isn't garish, but I raised my colour temperature. Now I've done that a few times in a few different shoots that I've shown you. What that means is that the pink qualities, the yellow qualities are heightened slightly, which means I don't end up looking completely dead, because I don't want that. And the other thing I did in this particular image, because I'm talking about my silly human vanity, is I increased the sharpness. So as much as it's uncomfortable for me because of my vanity, I emphasised, the wrinkles on my face. You can see in the image there, I've heightened something that often in fashion photography certainly is taken out, it's airbrushed away. This, the bag under the eye, the kind of jowliness of my face. I've not hidden that away. I've not tried to conceal that in any way. I've made that a very real part of what this photograph is. The quality of my skin, for example, because I've raised the sharpness, has become almost kind of mottled. I think that's a useful thing in this particular photograph for this context. So let's go back to your task. You're going to upload your work onto your website. The title of that is going to be The Looking Glass. We're thinking about the interplay between reflections and a human model with objects that are meaningful in the Vanitas style. That's it in a nutshell. So the plan, producing this shoot is going to take you a bit more time than usual. You've got maybe more objects to think about. You've got different light qualities to shoot in. And again, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that I too was using completely natural light. Each prop should have context within the broader meaning of Vanitas. That means I would expect to see some things in there that are timeless up to a point. So glass vessels or watches, clocks, fruit and flowers, things that don't belong just to now. And then your stretch and challenge, moving image, going back to that reference of Sam Taylor Wood. As usual, I'm looking forward to seeing what you produce. I think the potential for you to make really beautiful images with this task is great. And thank you very much for tuning into my presentations. Have a lovely summer holiday for those of you I won't be seeing in our next lesson. And good luck.